We're going to struggle a little bit this morning. At least I'm going to struggle a little bit this morning, and I hope you'll join me in that. I was at a meeting early this past week. That's not the struggle part, those of you who know how much I love meetings. That's not the struggle part. It was actually a great meeting. I can't tell you exactly what it was all about because that would take way too long. But briefly, there's a community that has, over the last 10 to 12 years, developed what was, I think, initially called a wellness committee, a community wellness committee. And the idea was to have representation from each of the important sort of cornerstones of community. So from social services, health, spiritual, the police, education, the school was represented there. And the idea was to connect them, to network them in a way that allowed them to share information and to talk confidentially, of course, about people in the community so that they could all connect them to all of the resources and needs that meet the needs that they had. And it worked great. It worked so good, they actually created a model for it, which they're now sharing with other communities. And it's so good even the government likes it. I'm not sure whether that actually is a positive or not, but still, it really is good. And they're sharing it with other communities. They're calling it I'm going to get this terribly wrong probably, but the important words are comprehensive collaborative model for care. Right? So it involves everyone in a collaborative way. And they've been sharing this model with other communities. And almost everyone thinks it's awesome. At the meeting on Monday, I heard about how they'd presented it in one community and the really positive, enthusiastic response. Another one, though, did not have a positive response. It was very negative. They were not particularly interested even in the presentation. Although I understand there were donuts or muffins, I can't remember which. The point is, it caused me to think, well, why wouldn't you? And I started to wonder about collaboration. And why do people not get collaboration? And the short answer is no. No, we don't. We don't. Because we've learned that collaboration is pretty much the same thing as saying like partnership or, sharing stuff, making a deal with somebody. And it's not. It's not. Because collaboration demands things of you. And one thing it very much demands of you is that you let go. And it will not surprise you to hear that people don't like that part. It requires you to let go of things. It requires you, first of all, to let go of control, because you are collaborating with others. You are not the boss. It requires you to let go of things like preconceived ideologies and traditions and cultures and things in a way that allows you to either offer it to the collaboration or realize that it doesn't belong and you have to let it go. Will not surprise you to hear that people don't like that part either. But it's necessary because true collaboration requires everyone to put in what they need, what they have, who they are, in order to create a new thing. That's what the collaboration is. It's a new thing that allows everyone to benefit from it. Now, if that language sounds familiar, and you've heard me say it before, you have, because you'd think of all of the people who might understand collaboration. Christians and Jews would understand collaboration, you'd think, because we are people of covenant. And you've heard me talk about covenant before, I'm sure, because I love to talk about covenant. It's a very sort of faith-based word, I guess, in the way that we use it to describe a collaboration. The best example I always give is in the United Church, we covenant between a minister, a congregation or faith community, and the wider church. And what that means is we each put who we are into it in order to create a new thing, a ministry. This ministry that we call Rising Spirit, or DKR, or Panoka United Church, or Bashaw United Church. Whatever language you want to use to describe it, we've created a new thing. Now, if you're thinking, oh no, we've been around for ages, that name has, but in this form, it hasn't, because we created something new. Together. That's the point of collaboration. First of all, in entering into a collaboration, you're not making a deal. It's not a contract. You're not saying, I'll put in X in order that I get Y out. It's not your personal benefit. You will benefit, but it's not your personal benefit that's the thing that we get. What we get is the benefit to community. We get the benefit of how it builds relationships, of how it supports and cares for people, whoever they are and however they are. That's what it does. And when you do it comprehensively, you are entering into a collaboration that creates wholeness in community. I'm just going to qualify that slightly. I believe that's the way we want to describe it, but I'm going to qualify it slightly by saying we're endeavoring to create wholeness in community. Because there's lots of struggles in entering into collaboration, and those struggles involve things like all of that stuff we have to let go. You aren't the boss anymore in a collaboration. The collaboration is the boss. The thing you're trying to create is the boss. You need to let go of some of the preconceived ideas you have about other people and those things that they do, and engage with them in order to find out what is true. You might need to let go of preconceived ideas you have about the people you're collaborating with. You absolutely have to let go of any preconceived ideas you have of the people you're going to collaborate with in order that you might find out what is true with them. You need to be prepared to be vulnerable. Because if you're not, if you can't be, you're not truly participating in it. Because the goal is for it to include not just the gifts you have to offer, but the truth you have to offer, who you truly are. And in sharing that with others, in receiving that from others, we create this new thing that allows us to work together to make something better, to make a better community. That can apply to a faith community. It can apply to a wider community. It can apply to, a province or a nation. '21st century Jesus at this point would say, okay, but what's your point here, Robin? We're supposed to be talking about reconciliation. But I think he'd say it really sarcastically because I think he knows exactly where I'm going with this. And he'd remind us about that story that first century Jesus told. More accurately, he'd remind us, he wishes that first century Jesus hadn't told the story. This moment of the Great Commandment, right? The Great Commandment is what we call that thing where Jesus says, the greatest commandment of all is to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. And that appears in 3 of the 4 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have this story. Except that's not entirely accurate. The way Luke tells the story, Jesus doesn't say it. He throws it back to the person who asks the question, who answers from the law, from Deuteronomy and Leviticus. Love God, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And then Jesus says, good for you. You've done well. The reason I think Luke tells the story this way, knowing the other version, is that he wants to answer a question that the other 2 don't. Who's my neighbor? And sure enough, the lawyer, because that's who it is, asks, but who is my neighbor? And Jesus launches into the famous Good Samaritan story, which I'm sure we all know. If not from the Bible, we know a version of it because we've heard a story that tells a similar kind of story. And I kind of wish actually Jesus hadn't told that story, at least not in this moment. I wish instead he'd continued that line of asking questions back to the lawyer and said, I wish Jesus had said, well, who do you think your neighbor is? And then each time the lawyer would say something, comfortable and easy, Jesus would say, okay, but what about this person or that person? And he gave very specific examples of people who are poor or hungry, marginalized, different cultures, different traditions. Might even mention Samaritans. But he'd put it back on the person who asked the question to actually think for themselves and not wait for Jesus to tell them. I think sometimes we hear this account and we hear Jesus tell this story about the Good Samaritan and we go, yeah. And then, of course, someone explains to us what the relationship between Jews and Samaritans was in those days, still is, and we'd understand better. But we'd still be hearing a story which is not very personal at all. And I think this is a moment for a very personal story. This is a moment for Jesus to say, who do you think your neighbor is? The one really cool thing about the Good Samaritan story, which I think we sometimes neglect, is that Jesus very clearly points out it's not just about who you think your neighbor is, but how and why they're your neighbor. Because they ain't your neighbor if you aren't a good neighbor to them first, are they? If you don't be a good neighbor to them, how will you know? Because being a good neighbor means you find out things first. You don't assume things first. You let go of your preconceived ideas. You let go of control so that you can find out, so that you can engage them and ask questions, so that you can offer to them something of who you truly are, which in Jesus' mind, of course, is going to be, you are good, inherently good from the beginning. So why wouldn't you lead with that? Jesus is always reminding people to let go of fear because God is there. Lead with the good that you are. Be true to you. And find out what is true of your neighbor. We're really good at building the walls. We're really good at building fences to define our define our boundary. We're not so good at letting that boundary drop for long enough to find out what's true of others. I intentionally misspoke earlier when I said I started to realize that we don't understand collaboration. And by the way, I didn't either until I actually thought about it. Because my first thought wasn't what we have to let go. My first thought was give up. Because that's how we perceive it. I have something, and in order to engage others, I have to give it up. I have control. I have power. I have privilege that allows me to treat others a certain way. What if you didn't? What if you let that go? What if you, and this is the thing, we always think of it as having to give it up, as if that's a bad thing. Let it go. Please don't anyone sing the song because you'll ruin the moment. But that is absolutely true. Let it go. That's how we engage people. That's how we encounter people. And here's the thing about truth and reconciliation. The other thing 21st century Jesus would say was, thank goodness you didn't ask this of first century Jesus, because he wouldn't know what you mean. I know when you say reconciliation, immediately I'm going to think you're talking about truth and reconciliation. And I think if your head went there right away, even as a church person where we talk about reconciliation for centuries, if your head went there right away, good. Because it means it's already in your head. You just have to move it down a little lower into your heart, and then we're going somewhere. The point is, it's not just reconciliation. We can't get there if we don't hear the truth part. And there's two pieces to that truth part. One is we need to let go of the privilege that we have that allows us to control and hear the truth. That means we have to stop saying things like, I'm just tired of hearing this now, or it's in the past. We need to hear the truth. There's a second piece. We need to let go of our preconceived ideas of what people should be and how they should be, and allow for them to be true to who they are. Allow them to be true to who they are and tell us the truth of where we've come from. When we can start doing that, we can start heading towards reconciliation. The journey is going to be long. It took generations to get here. It's going to take us a long time to get there, whatever that vision of the future is, of a community of wholeness that we can only get to if we're prepared to collaborate on getting there. The other piece that we need to let go of is that we have a solution, and we're going to solve it right now, because we're not. What we are going to do is be part of the journey to it. Again, it took generations to get here, and not just the generations of residential schools, but the generations coming to that made us think we could get away with doing that to other people. It will take us generations, but we have to be part of the journey. We have to be part of the journey. There's a lot of things to let go in order to be vulnerable enough to be part of that journey. After all of the questions Jesus might ask, after asking the lawyer, well, who do you think your neighbor is? Well, what about these people? What about this neighbor or that neighbor? What about people who think this, or people who like that, or people who come from here? What about these? What about letting go of what you think you know in order to find out what's true? Because that would truly be bringing your true self, the goodness that you are, to the table. After asking all of those questions, maybe Jesus might ask something like, where do you think this is going? Where do you think this is going? Because the journey that we're headed on is wholeness. To be truly reconciled, whether it's to God or to your neighbor, is to be whole. I always thought that one of the downsides to using a word like reconciliation is that we tend to apply it to situations where we never were. And reconciliation sounds like we're making something good again. What about relationships that never were good? We aren't trying to build ourselves back to a vision of something that once was. We're trying to build ourselves to a vision of wholeness and connectedness that we may not have ever had before. It's not about going back to a better time. It's about going forward to a better time. And it's a journey. It's a long journey. Journeys are best made together. That's what this process is about. It's about collaboration in its truest sense and building a whole community.